The Palace of Eternal Moons defied every architectural principle Ryan Cole had learned during his years protecting diplomats in hostile environments, which was probably the point. Built from what appeared to be crystallized starlight and wishful thinking, it rose from the landscape of Etheros Prime like a fever dream designed by someone with unlimited imagination and a complete disregard for structural engineering. "Try not to look too impressed," Ambassador Harrison muttered as their transport settled onto a landing platform that seemed to be made of solidified aurora. These people read body language like humans read road signs, and showing too much awe gives them negotiating advantages we can't afford. Ryan adjusted his diplomatic security gear and tried to look professionally unimpressed by architecture that made his brain hurt if he stared at it too long. "Understood, sir. Though I should probably mention that my threat assessment protocols aren't exactly calibrated for buildings that appear to be growing while I watch them." "Growing." The tower on the left has gained approximately 3 meters in height since we entered the atmosphere. Either my sensors are malfunctioning, or Etherian architecture has some very interesting properties that weren't covered in the briefing materials. Ambassador Harrison paused in his review of diplomatic protocol to stare at the palace complex. "Wonderful. Negotiating peace with people whose buildings evolve during conversations. This assignment just keeps getting better." Their reception committee consisted of beings that looked almost human, except for the delicately pointed ears and the elaborate veils that concealed their facial features. The Etherians moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were more comfortable with the palace's impossible geometry than visitors had any right to expect, gliding across surfaces that seemed to shift between solid and translucent based on viewing angle. "Welcome, honored representatives of humanity," said the lead figure, whose voice carried harmonics that Ryan's universal translator struggled to parse. "I am Counselor Viridian, first advisor to Her Royal Highness Princess Lyrelith. Her Highness regrets that urgent matters of state prevent her from greeting you personally." "Urgent matters of state," Harrison repeated with the diplomatic smile that never reached his eyes. "Of course. Please convey our understanding to Her Highness and our eagerness to begin productive negotiations." As they were escorted through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves based on traffic patterns, Ryan made mental notes of defensive positions, escape routes, and potential threats. The security implications of architecture that changed configuration were staggering, but what caught his attention more was the way the Etherian escort moved, not with the confident authority he'd expect from royal advisors, but with the careful tension of people navigating political minefields. "The diplomatic quarters are designed for optimal comfort and security," Counselor Viridian explained, gesturing to chambers that looked like they'd been carved from single pieces of opal and furnished with light fixtures that appeared to be domesticated stars. "All communication systems are quantum encrypted to prevent eavesdropping, and the environmental controls can accommodate any atmospheric requirements." "Very thoughtful," Ryan replied, though his security scanner was picking up energy signatures that suggested the chambers were monitored by systems considerably more sophisticated than standard diplomatic surveillance. "I assume standard diplomatic immunity protocols apply." "Of course, though I should mention that certain areas of the palace are restricted during the current negotiations. Ancient traditions require privacy for royal contemplation during times of significant decision-making." Harrison's expression suggested he found the explanation less than completely satisfactory, but diplomatic protocol required accepting host security arrangements with gracious understanding. "We appreciate your accommodations and look forward to productive discussions." That evening's welcoming reception took place in a ballroom that existed in more dimensions than Ryan was comfortable calculating, filled with Etherians whose veiled faces made individual identification nearly impossible. The effect was elegant and disorienting, like attending a party in a hall of mirrors where all the reflections were slightly wrong. Princess Lyrillith made her entrance with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it, tall and graceful in robes that seemed to capture and reflect the ambient light, her veil more elaborate than the others, but concealing her features just as completely. When she spoke, her voice carried authority that suggested both royal training and genuine intelligence. Ambassador Harrison, Security Specialist Cole, welcome to Etheros Prime. We hope your time here will mark the beginning of lasting peace between our peoples. Your Highness, Harrison replied with proper diplomatic courtesy, we share that hope and look forward to productive negotiations. As the formal pleasantries continued, Ryan found himself studying the crowd dynamics with professional interest. Royal receptions typically involved carefully choreographed displays of support for the ruling family, but what he observed was more complex. Princess Lyrillith was clearly the center of attention, but the attention felt forced rather than natural. Too much careful distance, too many conversations that stopped when she approached, too many glances that looked more like evaluation than admiration. Is it customary for Etherian nobles to maintain such formal distance from their princess? Ryan asked quietly during a lull in the diplomatic conversation. Counselor Viridian's response came a fraction of a second too quickly. Her Highness prefers to maintain appropriate dignity during international negotiations. It would be inappropriate for court politics to interfere with matters of such importance. The explanation was reasonable, but Ryan's training and threat assessment flagged it as incomplete. Court politics didn't just disappear during international negotiations. They usually intensified, especially when the negotiations involved treaty terms that would bind the realm for generations. As the evening progressed, and the formal reception gave way to smaller conversation groups, Ryan continued his observations. Princess Lyrillith moved through the crowd with practiced diplomatic skill, but he noticed that her conversations tended to be brief, that advisors approached her with careful deference that felt more like wariness than respect, and that certain groups of nobles seemed to be having intense discussions that stopped whenever she came within earshot. Ambassador, Ryan said when they finally returned to their quarters after midnight, I think we may be missing some important context about the internal political situation here. Meaning the princess appears to be under some sort of political pressure from her own court, and our intelligence briefings didn't mention any internal Etherian conflicts that might complicate these negotiations. Harrison considered this, his expression growing concerned. Internal power struggles could definitely affect their negotiating position. What kind of pressure are we talking about? Hard to say without more information. But the body language suggests she's not as secure in her position as we assumed, and that could make her either more desperate to conclude a favorable agreement or less able to deliver on whatever terms we negotiate. Keep monitoring the situation, Harrison said finally. But remember, our job is to negotiate peace with whoever has the authority to enforce it. If there are succession issues, that's an internal Etherian matter. As Ryan settled into his assigned quarters and reviewed the day's security logs, he found himself thinking about Princess Lyrillith's voice during the reception, confident and diplomatic, but carrying undertones that suggested she was fighting battles on multiple fronts. He had no way of knowing that some of those battles would soon require him to make decisions that went far beyond his security specialist training, or that the most dangerous threats to the peace negotiations would come from within the palace itself, rather than from external enemies. But he was beginning to suspect that his role in these negotiations might be more complicated than simply protecting Ambassador Harrison from political embarrassment. The security alert came at 3:47 hours, 3 days into negotiations that had been making frustratingly little progress. Ryan's combat reflexes had him fully alert before the automated systems finished announcing, unauthorized energy signature detected, diplomatic quarters, Section 7. All personnel implement lockdown protocols. came the voice of Counselor Veridian over the communication system. Security teams are investigating potential infiltration. Diplomatic staff, please remain in secure locations until all clear is issued. Ryan was already moving, tactical gear activated and threat assessment protocols running full diagnostics. The energy signature readings were confusing, not the clean patterns of weapons or surveillance devices, but something more complex that his scanners couldn't classify. Ambassador Harrison, report status, he called into his comm unit. Secure in quarters, no immediate threats detected, came the reply. What's your assessment? Unknown. Energy patterns don't match any known threat profiles, but I'm moving to investigate. Ryan paused his analysis as another alert chimed. Sir, I'm showing that Princess Lyrillith is not in a secure location. She's in the East Observatory, which isn't covered by the palace's automated defenses. The palace security will handle royal protection. Your priority is the diplomatic mission. Understood, but if something happens to the princess during peace negotiations while we're guests in her palace, the diplomatic ramifications could be significant. Ryan was already heading toward the observatory, his security instincts overruling protocol concerns. I'm going to provide backup security until her people can reach her. The East Observatory turned out to be another architectural impossibility, a sphere of transparent crystal that seemed to float without visible support, offering panoramic views of Etheros Prime's aurora-painted sky. Princess Lyrillith stood at its center, still veiled but no longer wearing the formal robes of state. In simpler clothing, she looked younger and somehow more vulnerable. Security Specialist Cole, she said without turning around, I assume you're here because of the alert. Yes, Your Highness. Palace security is investigating the energy signatures, but this location isn't part of the secured areas. I thought it would be prudent to ensure your safety until the situation is resolved. How very thoughtful. Princess Lyrillith turned to face him, and even through the veil, Ryan could sense that she was studying him with unusual intensity. Tell me, do humans often prioritize the safety of alien royalty over their own diplomatic objectives? The question carried undertones that suggested it was more than casual curiosity. I prioritize the safety of anyone who might be in danger, regardless of their species or political status. It's part of the job. Just part of the job. Ryan considered the question, aware that they were venturing into conversational territory not covered by diplomatic protocol. I suppose I also believe that peace negotiations work better when all the negotiators survive the process. Princess Lyrillith made a sound that might have been laughter, a practical philosophy. Though I wonder what you would do if protecting me conflicted with protecting your own diplomatic mission. Hopefully make the right choice. Though I'll admit, determining what's right can be complicated when politics get involved. Yes, she said quietly, moving to stand near one of the crystal walls where the aurora painted her veiled figure in shifting colors. Politics certainly complicate everything. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, charged with implications Ryan couldn't quite identify. Princess Lyrillith seemed to be wrestling with some internal decision, her posture suggesting the kind of tension that came from carrying burdens too large for any individual. May I ask you something? She said finally. Of course, Your Highness. What do you know about Etherian marking traditions? Ryan accessed his cultural briefing files mentally. I understand that the facial markings beneath your veils serve multiple purposes: genealogical records, spiritual significance, and indicators of social standing. The patterns are unique to each individual and considered sacred to your people. That's accurate as far as it goes. Princess Lyrillith's voice carried notes of something that might have been sadness. But it doesn't mention that some patterns are considered more acceptable than others. Acceptable in what way? In the way that determines whether someone is fit to rule, worthy of respect, or destined for exile. She turned back toward him, though the veil still concealed her expression. Your human cultures have similar concepts, don't they? Physical characteristics that some societies consider marks of favor or curses. Ryan thought about Earth's long history of prejudice based on physical appearance, the countless ways humans had used arbitrary characteristics to justify treating each other as less than equal. Unfortunately, yes. Though most of us have learned that judging people based on physical traits usually says more about the judges than the judged. An enlightened perspective, though I wonder if you would maintain that view if the traits in question were dramatically different from what you consider normal. Before Ryan could respond, his communication unit crackled with an update. All clear issued, energy signatures identified as atmospheric interference from solar activity. Standard operations may resume. Well, Ryan said, mystery solved. Though I have to admit, solar interference that triggers security alerts seems like a design flaw in the monitoring systems. Yes, Princess Lyrillith agreed, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by the explanation. How convenient that it resolved itself just as we were having such an interesting conversation. Ryan's security training flagged the comment as potentially significant. Your Highness, do you have reason to believe the alert was something other than solar interference? I have reason to believe many things, Security Specialist Cole. The question is whether those beliefs serve any useful purpose or merely complicate an already complex situation. As they left the observatory and returned to the main palace complex, Ryan found himself analyzing the evening's conversation for subtext and implications. Princess Lyrillith's questions about marking traditions and physical acceptance seemed too specific to be casual cultural exchange, while her reaction to the convenient resolution of the security alert suggested she suspected manipulation. Your Highness, Ryan said as they reached the intersection where their paths would diverge, if you ever need additional security consultation, officially or otherwise, please don't hesitate to contact me. Sometimes an outside perspective can be useful. Princess Lyrillith paused, and for a moment Ryan had the impression she was considering saying something important. Instead, she simply nodded. Thank you, Security Specialist Cole. Your offer is more valuable than you might realize. As she disappeared down the crystalline corridor toward the royal quarters, Ryan made his way back to the diplomatic section, with the growing certainty that the peace negotiations were more complicated than anyone had briefed him about, and that the real threats might be coming from within the Etherian court rather than from any external source. He also couldn't shake the feeling that Princess Lyrillith's questions about physical acceptance and marking traditions had been leading toward a revelation that the convenient security alert had prevented. Some conversations, Ryan reflected, were interrupted by coincidence. Others were interrupted by design. The trick was figuring out which category tonight's discussion fell into, and whether the interruption had been intended to protect him or her. The communication breakdown began subtly. First, a delay in routine diplomatic traffic, then intermittent losses of connection with the human fleet in orbit. Finally, a complete blackout that left the diplomatic mission isolated within the Palace of Eternal Moons. The technical explanations grew increasingly elaborate. Solar flare activity, quantum interference, atmospheric ionization effects that required extensive recalibration. Convenient timing, Ambassador Harrison muttered as palace technicians assured them that repairs would take at least 12 hours. Right when we're supposed to be receiving updated negotiating instructions from Earth Command. Ryan's security analysis painted a different picture. The communication failures followed patterns that suggested systematic sabotage rather than natural interference, and the repair timeline conveniently extended past the dawn deadline for several Etherian ceremonial requirements that he didn't fully understand, but that seemed to be causing considerable anxiety among the palace staff. Ambassador, Ryan said during what was supposed to be a brief status meeting, I recommend we consider the possibility that the communication blackout is intentional. The timing and pattern suggest coordination rather than coincidence. But intentional by whom, us or them? Unknown, but I think I know someone who might have insights. Ryan checked his tactical display, noting the positions of various palace personnel. Princess Lyrelith hasn't been seen in the official areas since the blackout began, which either means she's in secure communications with her own people, or she's been isolated just like us. Harrison considered this, find her. But remember, if this is internal Etherian politics, we cannot afford to be seen as taking sides. The search led Ryan through corridors that seemed more fluid than usual, architecture shifting, in response to some emergency protocol that kept redirecting him away from the royal quarters and toward the outer observation areas. He finally found Princess Lyrelith in the Dawn Observatory, the highest point in the palace complex, where the first light of Ethero's prime sun was beginning to paint the crystalline walls in shades of gold and rose. She was no longer wearing her veil. Ryan's first glimpse of her uncovered face stopped him in the observatory's entrance, not because of any alien strangeness, but because of how completely it reframed everything he thought he'd understood about Etherian society and the princess's position within it. Her markings were extraordinary. Instead of the simple geometric patterns Ryan had seen in cultural databases, Princess Lyrelith bore markings that seemed to shift and flow across her features like living art. The patterns incorporated symbols he recognized from ancient Etherian texts mixed with configurations that seemed to tell stories spanning generations, all rendered in colors that existed at the edge of human visual perception. "You shouldn't be here," she said without turning around, her voice carrying a mixture of resignation and desperate hope. "The communication blackout was meant to ensure privacy, but if you're found here when the sun rises..." "When the sun rises, what?" Princess Lyrelith turned to face him fully, her unveiled features illuminated by the growing dawn light. The markings seemed even more complex in direct light, patterns within patterns that suggested both incredible beauty and something that others might consider deeply wrong. "The right of witness," she said quietly. "An ancient law that requires the heir's legitimacy to be confirmed by an impartial observer before they can assume full authority. The communication blackout ensures that whatever happens next cannot be influenced by outside political pressures." Ryan looked at her magnificent, impossible markings, beginning to understand why the Etherian court had been treating her with such careful distance. "Your markings, they're what some of your people consider cursed." Cursed, contaminated, spiritually compromised. The terms vary, but the meaning is consistent. My bloodline includes genetic markers that traditional Etherian society views as signs of spiritual corruption. Princess Lyrelith's voice remained steady, but Ryan could see the vulnerability in her posture. The right of witness allows an impartial observer to judge whether someone with such markings can legitimately rule. And if the witness accepts you, then my authority becomes unassailable, regardless of traditional prejudices. But if the witness rejects me..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Ryan understood the implications. "Exile. Permanent exile, and the throne passes to my cousin, who has been working with certain factions to ensure that these peace negotiations fail." Princess Lyrelith stepped closer, and Ryan could see that her extraordinary markings extended beyond her face, creating patterns across her neck and arms that were like nothing in any cultural database. "Ryan, may I call you Ryan? I need to ask you something, and your answer will determine the fate of both our peoples." The use of his first name, the dropping of all formal titles and diplomatic protocol, marked this as something beyond politics or international relations. This was personal in ways that would have repercussions spanning star systems. "What's the question?" Princess Lyrelith took a breath that seemed to draw in all her courage from across the years of hiding, political maneuvering, and careful concealment behind veils and formal protocol. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ancient law and desperate hope. "Could you love me like this?" not as a political alliance or diplomatic convenience, but as I actually am, marked by bloodlines that my own people consider contaminated, bearing patterns that traditional society views as evidence of spiritual corruption, standing before you without veils or pretense as someone whose very existence challenges everything my culture has taught about worthiness and legitimacy. The dawn light streaming through the observatory's crystal walls caught her markings and transformed them into something that seemed to exist partially in dimensions Ryan's eyes weren't designed to perceive. Beautiful, alien, impossible, and utterly unlike anything he'd expected when he'd accepted this assignment. Your answer, Princess Lyrillith continued, activates the right of witness. If you accept me as I am, your witness validates my right to rule despite the cursed markings. If you reject me, I lose all claim to the throne and face permanent exile. Ryan stared at her, understanding finally descending on him like a weight that threatened to crush his chest. This wasn't just about personal attraction or cross-species romance. His answer would determine whether the peace negotiations continued under her leadership or collapsed under her cousin's traditionalist agenda. It would decide whether Etherian society moved toward acceptance of genetic diversity or retreated into prejudice and isolation. Most importantly, it would bind his fate to hers in ways that transcended both human and Etherian law. How long do I have to decide? Until the sun finishes rising. The right of witness must be completed before the dawn ends, or it defaults to rejection. Ryan looked out at the growing light painting Etheros Prime's impossible landscape in colors that had no names, then back at Princess Lyrillith's magnificent, forbidden markings that told stories of bloodlines and heritage that spanned millennia. He thought about Ambassador Harrison's instruction to avoid taking sides in internal Etherian politics, about the diplomatic complications of binding humanity to alien royal succession laws, about the career implications of making decisions that transcended his security specialist authority. Then he thought about Princess Lyrillith's question, could he love her like this? The answer, Ryan realized, had been growing in his mind since the moment he decided to check on her safety, rather than following strict protocol, crystallizing through every conversation they'd shared, and every glimpse he'd caught of the intelligence and dedication she brought to the impossible task of negotiating peace, while fighting for her own political survival. Yes, he said simply, I could love you exactly like this. The words seemed to ignite something in the observatory's crystal structure, light patterns flowing through the walls in response to his answer. Somewhere in the palace, Ryan could hear alarms beginning to sound, whether in celebration or warning, he couldn't tell. Princess Lyrillith's smile was radiant enough to rival the rising sun. Then we'd better prepare for the interesting consequences, she said, because your answer just made both of us the most important political targets on this planet. As the dawn completed its rise and the right of witness became binding law, Ryan realized that his simple assignment to protect a diplomatic mission had just evolved into something that would reshape the relationship between two civilizations. And somehow, despite the impossible complexity of everything that was about to follow, he found himself looking forward to discovering what came next. The consequences of Ryan's answer began manifesting before the echo of his words had faded from the crystal observatory. Emergency signals cascaded through the palace's communication systems, as various factions received word that the right of witness had been successfully completed, legitimizing Princess Lyrillith's rule and invalidating every political maneuver designed around her expected exile. Well, Princess Lyrillith said, watching tactical displays show armed groups converging on their location from 3 directions, I should probably mention that accepting me as your ruler has made you a target for assassination by anyone who preferred the previous succession scenario. The previous succession scenario. My cousin Prince Verthak, who has been promising various human corporations exclusive mining rights to our sacred sites in exchange for military support for his claim to the throne. She activated the observatory's defensive systems, and Ryan watched energy barriers spring into existence around them. Your witness has just invalidated all of those agreements. Ryan's security training kicked in as he assessed their tactical situation. How long can these barriers hold? Against conventional weapons, indefinitely. Against the kind of advanced human military equipment that Verthak has been secretly importing through his corporate allies, perhaps 20 minutes. Advanced human military equipment, Ryan repeated, feeling pieces click together in his mind. That's why the communication blackout was necessary. Someone on our side has been coordinating with Verthak to ensure the peace negotiations fail. Your Ambassador Harrison, specifically. Though I suspect he was acting under orders from officials who view continued conflict as preferable to genuine peace. Princess Lyrillith, now Queen Lyrillith, Ryan realized, pulled up holographic displays showing intercepted communications between the human embassy and Prince Verthak's faction. They needed to ensure that my cousin could claim the throne and sign more favorable agreements. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as enhanced human weapons began testing the observatory's defenses. Energy barriers that should have been impenetrable started showing stress fractures under bombardment from military-grade plasma cannons that had no business being on a diplomatic mission. Ryan, Queen Lyrillith said, using his name with an intimacy that cut through the chaos of impending combat. There's something else you need to know about what your acceptance means. The right of witness doesn't just validate royal authority. It creates a permanent bond between the witness and the ruler. Your fate and mine are now legally and spiritually intertwined. Meaning that if I die, you die. And if you die, I lose the legitimacy your witness provided. She smiled with the kind of gallows humor that Ryan was learning to appreciate. So we have considerable incentive to keep each other alive. Good to know. Any suggestions for how we accomplish that when we're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a crystal sphere with no apparent exits? Actually, yes. Queen Lyrillith activated systems that Ryan hadn't realized existed, and suddenly the observatory began to move, detaching from its position atop the palace and transitioning into something that looked suspiciously like a spacecraft. Did I mention that Etherian architecture tends to be more versatile than most species expect? The palace falling away beneath them as the observatory achieved flight was surreal enough, but watching it reconfigure itself into a defensive fortress, while launching its own aircraft to intercept the pursuing attackers, crossed into territory that Ryan's brain simply refused to process as normal. Your buildings can fly. Our important buildings can fly. It's been a useful feature during previous succession crises. Queen Lyrillith piloted their improvised escape vehicle with casual competence while monitoring displays that showed the larger tactical situation. Though I should warn you that we're heading toward the most dangerous part of this whole situation. More dangerous than being shot at by human military equipment. More dangerous than that, yes. We're about to broadcast proof of the conspiracy to every major power in the sector, which means that everyone involved in the original plan now has considerable incentive to ensure we don't survive the next few hours. The broadcast array they reached was another impossible structure, a network of crystalline transmission nodes that seemed to exist partially in hyperspace, capable of instantaneous communication across galactic distances. As Queen Lyrillith uploaded the evidence of human Etherian conspiracy, Ryan watched their pursuing forces multiply as word spread that the planned succession crisis had failed. "This is Ambassador Harrison," came a transmission from one of the pursuing craft. "Mr. Cole, you have exceeded your authority and compromised the diplomatic mission. Return the Etherian asset to our custody immediately." Etherian asset. Ryan looked at Queen Lyrillith, whose markings were shifting through color patterns that suggested either amusement or homicidal fury. "They're referring to you as an asset." "How charming. and utterly consistent with their view that my people exist primarily to facilitate their resource extraction operations. She opened a communication channel that would broadcast across multiple star systems. Ambassador Harrison, this is Queen Lyrillith of Etheros Prime. Your authority on this world ended the moment you chose to support an illegal coup attempt. You have 30 minutes to withdraw all human military personnel, or face charges of war crimes under galactic law. You're bluffing. The Galactic Council won't intervene in internal succession disputes. Perhaps not, but they will certainly intervene when provided with evidence that human corporations have been funding both sides of a border conflict to maintain profitable resource extraction operations while preventing legitimate peace negotiations. Queen Lyrillith activated another display, this one showing financial records that painted a clear picture of systematic manipulation spanning decades. Evidence that is now being transmitted to every major news network and government in this sector. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Ryan to wonder if Harrison was consulting with his superiors, attempting to calculate damage control, or simply processing the magnitude of the political catastrophe that was about to engulf everyone involved in the conspiracy. "Mr. Cole," Harrison said finally, "you realize that your actions have made you a fugitive from human justice. You cannot return to human space." "Actually," Queen Lyrillith said before Ryan could respond, "under the terms of the right of witness, he now holds dual citizenship and diplomatic immunity as both human security specialist and Etherian royal consort. He can travel freely between both our territories." "Royal consort. Did I not mention that? The bond created by your acceptance includes marriage rights under Etherian law. Congratulations, we're officially wed by the authority of ancient tradition and quantum mechanics." Ryan stared at her, then at the tactical displays showing the conspiracy unraveling in real time as evidence broadcasts triggered investigations across human space. Then back at his apparently new wife whose cursed markings were shifting through what appeared to be patterns of satisfaction and affection. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said. "In the space of about 6 hours, I've become a royal witness, legitimized your claim to the throne, married you under alien law, helped expose a galactic conspiracy, and apparently gained dual citizenship while becoming a fugitive from my own species." "That's an accurate summary, yes. Though I should probably also mention that you're now technically immortal under certain interpretations of Etherian spiritual law, and you have voting rights in approximately 17 interstellar commercial treaties." Ryan looked out at the impossible vista of Etheros Prime below them, where the Palace of Eternal Moons was systematically dismantling the attacking forces, while broadcasting surrender terms that would end the conflict on Lyrillith's terms rather than the conspirators' preferences. "You know," he said finally, "when I took this assignment, the most complicated decision I expected to make was which diplomatic reception to attend. And now I'm married to someone whose facial markings are more beautiful than anything I've ever seen, whose people build architecture that doubles as spacecraft, and whose idea of political problem-solving involves hijacking communication satellites to expose galactic conspiracies." He took her hand, noting how her markings seemed to pulse gently in response to his touch. "I have to say, it's considerably more interesting than routine diplomatic security. More interesting than you anticipated. More interesting than I knew was possible." Ryan looked at the displays showing human forces withdrawing from Etherian space, while emergency diplomatic channels buzzed with damage control efforts. "Though I should probably warn you that I have absolutely no idea how to be a royal consort. My training covered threat assessment and embassy protection, not quantum marriage ceremonies and interstellar succession law." Queen Lyrillith's laugh carried harmonics that made the observatory's crystal structure resonate in sympathy. "I have no idea how to be married to a human security specialist, whose idea of romantic gestures apparently includes validating my right to rule despite genetic prejudice and exposing conspiracies that span star systems. I think we'll figure it out together. 3 months later, Ryan stood on the observation deck of New Etheros Station, the first joint human-Etherian diplomatic facility, watching ships from both civilizations dock at platforms that had been designed using architectural principles that neither species could have developed alone. His official title was Cultural Integration Specialist, which sounded considerably more dignified than accidental royal consort who stumbled into galactic politics. The morning briefing includes updates on the war crimes trials, 17 trade negotiation requests, and what appears to be a formal apology from the human government, along with an offer to make you Secretary of Interspecies Relations, announced his AI assistant, a hybrid system that combined human efficiency protocols with Etherian intuitive processing in ways that occasionally resulted in philosophical observations about the cosmic significance of filing systems. Secretary of Interspecies Relations, Ryan mused, sipping coffee from a mug that had been a wedding gift from Queen Lyrillith's grandmother, and which appeared to be carved from crystallized time. From security specialist to cabinet-level diplomat in 3 months, that might be some kind of record. It's definitely a record for accidentally becoming qualified for jobs that didn't exist before you created the need for them, Queen Lyrillith said, joining him at the viewport. Her markings had grown even more complex since their marriage, incorporating new patterns that seemed to represent their shared experiences and the changes they'd brought to both their civilizations. Any regrets? Ryan asked, the same question she'd asked him months ago in very different circumstances. About marrying a human who thinks appropriate courtship involves exposing galactic conspiracies and restructuring international law. Queen Lyrillith smiled, her markings shifting into configurations that Ryan had learned to recognize as contentment mixed with anticipation. Only that we didn't have time for a proper honeymoon before becoming responsible for completely rebuilding diplomatic relations between our species. Well, we could probably take a vacation now. The conspiracy trials are winding down, the new trade agreements are mostly stable, and both our governments seem to have accepted that we're a permanent fixture in interstellar politics. Where would we go? Ryan looked out at the impossible vista beyond the station, where ships from dozens of species traveled routes that had been opened by the new era of cooperation between humans and Etherians. Somewhere with architecture that doesn't move when you're not looking at it, atmospheric systems that don't require quantum mechanics to operate, and absolutely no diplomatic crises that need immediate resolution. That sounds wonderfully boring. Exactly. Though knowing our luck, we'd probably discover some new form of interstellar conspiracy that requires us to accidentally revolutionize another aspect of galactic politics. Speaking of which, Queen Lyrillith said, activating a holographic display that showed incoming communication requests, the Centauri delegation has specifically requested that we mediate their territorial dispute with the Rigelian Confederacy. Apparently, our reputation for unconventional problem-solving has spread. Ryan examined the request, noting that the dispute involved resources, territorial boundaries, and cultural misunderstandings that could easily escalate into the kind of conflict that would require decades to resolve through conventional diplomacy. Unconventional problem-solving, he repeated. You mean they want us to accidentally stumble into marriage ceremonies that reshape their entire political structure? I think they're hoping for something slightly less dramatic. Though with us, you never know. Queen Lyrillith took his hand, her markings shifting into patterns that spoke of shared adventures and unlimited possibilities. What do you think? Ready for another impossible diplomatic challenge? Ryan looked at his wife, this extraordinary woman whose cursed markings had turned out to represent the genetic heritage that made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between species, whose political courage had exposed conspiracies that spanned star systems, and whose idea of marriage had included making him an equal partner in reshaping the balance of galactic power. "You know," he said with a grin that felt like it could power small spacecraft, "I used to think my job was to keep diplomats safe from political complications. Now I realize my job is to help create complications so interesting that everyone wants to be involved in solving them." Is that a yes? That's a definitely yes. Though I should probably warn the Centaurians that our approach to conflict resolution tends to involve quantum marriage ceremonies, architectural spacecraft, and the complete restructuring of international law. They'll learn to adapt. Everyone does eventually. As they began reviewing the details of their next impossible assignment, Ryan reflected on the strange trajectory his career had taken. He'd started as someone who protected others from making decisions that could change the course of history, and somehow become someone who specialized in making exactly those kinds of decisions. The work was more complex now, involving cultural integration protocols that spanned species and political frameworks that existed in dimensions human political science had never contemplated. But at its core, it was still the same job he'd always done: identifying what needed protection, figuring out how to protect it, and making sure it survived and thrived despite impossible odds. The only difference was that now, what needed protection sometimes meant the right of genetically diverse individuals to rule their people, and figuring out how to protect it involved marrying alien royalty and restructuring galactic civilization. And sometimes, if he was very lucky, it meant spending his days working alongside someone whose markings told stories of courage and transformation, whose people had taught him that beauty and worth could exist in forms his own culture had never imagined, and whose idea of sharing morning coffee included discussions of how to prevent interstellar wars while designing new forms of quantum architecture. Ryan Cole had always been in the business of diplomatic security. He just never imagined that the most